maximum, shooting it so he doesn't get burned. He's put in a cold area though. Like, maybe Todoroki puts him inside something. No, actually, Aizawa tries to get the coldest substance. Oh yeah, Momo could just create liquid nitrogen. And put him in a room of liquid nitrogen. He has to burn the entire room going, bah! So, Momo creates 7 jugs of, 7 giant containers of, because jug sounds kind of weird, but jugs, containers of liquid nitrogen. And puts it in a, and he has to sit in it. He goes, oh, my body parts are gonna be, when he goes in, he goes, go! He says, ah, burning it, trying to make it hotter. He goes, he puts his hand on it and then it burns. He goes, trying to build up his heat resistance. He goes, he's burning the water to maybe use his water better. I mean, he's using up his fire so he can use his fire much better. He just stays in there to build his tolerance to coldness. So then he can go on to moving his fireness. After he's done with that, he dumps it on himself going, ah! But then he says, Mr. Aizawa? He says, what's the wrong problem, child? He says, I'm stuck. He says, what do you mean? He says, liquid nitrogen freezes everything it touches. And my legs are frozen. And if you touch my leg, it's gonna explode. But then he finally burns his legs. He unfreezes his legs and says, ah, that's much better. Never doing that again. He says, then he says, then shoots fire all around him, creating a fire dome. Then he lights it in fire, he goes, ah, screaming in pain while he's in there. He goes, ah. In class when B arrives, Vlad says, what is wrong with your student? He says, he's building up his heat resistance. He's weak to heat. So he needs to build it up by putting himself through pain with heat, with his blue flames. He goes, help me. Kendo wants to go help because, like, he gonna die, but Eraser says no. He needs to build up his own heat resistance. He needs to build it up. He's just saying that because that's what he would usually do. But then when he's about to say, he stops. They don't hear screaming anymore. Then Eraser gets worried and says, Todoroki! And then he freezes it, but it doesn't freeze that much. It doesn't even freeze. He says, no, it's not working! Momo just grabs the liquid nitrogen and just pours it. He goes, done! He goes, ugh. And I see him on the floor. He goes, then he wakes. Then she pours it on him because she knows that it's already fine. He goes, ah, putting himself in another fire dome. He says, ah. Then he grabs the liquid nitrogen and pours it on him while he's in there. Goes, ah. And it's finally working. He's actually doing it. He goes, ah. And it's really working. He goes, then after a while they don't hear screaming. They hear him talking to himself, going, welcome to your office, settle down and take a seat. Please pay no attention to the terrifying scream. Oh yeah, there wouldn't be any extra lessons since everyone passed. There's a figure on in the hall. Stay calm, stay calm. There's a shadow on the wall. Stay calm, stay calm. So after 2 days later, when they're on the 3rd day, of course the villains would attack and Krishna sends blue fire. He says, then he burns it himself to try and... But then he does this. But then when he sees a fire, he says, liquid nitrogen! And puts out the fire and says... But then he's blasted by fire from behind. He goes, ah! But then he feels it. He feels fire, then he gets hit to the ground, but he actually doesn't fall. He goes, then he looks and sees Dobby. He says, who the hell are you? He says, I'm Dobby, and now it's time for you to die. But we have to kidnap you. You're our target. Then he rushes at him, and they have a combat battle going. He said, then Dobby shoots him with fire, but Christian just goes through it. He goes and punches him, going, fire punch! Boom! Then he punches him back, and then he says, jet burn! And punches. He goes, he says, then he shoots a giant blast of fire, but it doesn't do anything. He says, how? He says, this is what the summer training camp is for. Then comes and kicks him in the face, going, then he punches him in the face, going, he says, this is the power of friendship. Jet the burn! And shoots a jet burn at him. He goes, falling to his knee. Then they both shoot out their biggest fire blast and shoot it at each other, going. Then Dobby goes for his tectonic fire blast and shoots it. Christian says, Prominence! Burn! Easily defeating his attack. And everyone sees this giant clash. Well, actually, they're clashing. Christian goes, Eraser sees him doing this, and then he doesn't want to interfere in this. Christian goes, jet the burn! And when his runs down after his thing, he appears in front of him saying, jet burn! And punches in the face, sending him flying back. He goes, he says, Hell's Web! And creates a Hell's Web, and he can't escape. He says, then Midoriya skillfully maneuvers around all the Hell Webs and kicks Dobby in the face, making him hit it. He goes, Dobby goes, and falls down. But then Deku's about to get stabbed. Christian goes and puts both of his hands down, catching it, going, you know, like Naruto did with the sword, where he created the Shadow Clone, and then the Shadow Clone caught the sword. Christian basically does that, and then he's not bleeding, and he's bleeding. He goes, dang it. Then he jumps back, but she didn't get any blood on her knife. He goes, maybe I'll just dry up the blood with jet burn. He says, jet the burn! Boom! But the blood for some reason doesn't go away, and then he starts to feel dizzy. He goes, Then he falls to one knee, but then he turns into a little pebble, and puts it in his mouth, going, I'm kidding. He has them now. He has Christian and Tokoyami and Bakugo. He's stuck. Then everyone's trying their best to get him out. He releases Tokoyami. But then they see that Dobby also grabbed Christian and Bakugo. Then they say, see you later, Todoroki Shoto. Then goes in. They go, dang it! When Shoto tells Endeavor this, Endeavor's pissed. He goes, he got kidnapped and Eraser didn't do anything to stop it? Endeavor instantly rushes to Thing. And yells at him, why didn't he save his son? Because you were right next to him when he fought him. He says, because your son would have yelled at me and screamed at me for interfering in his fight. He says, also, that guy had blue fire for some reason. He says, didn't one of your children have blue fire besides him? He says, Todoroki, but he's dead. He goes, So then to the villain base. Christian and Baku are stuck in chain things. Christian says, Baku bro. He says, what did you call me? He says, Baku bro. Wake up. He says, okay, I'm up. He says, we're stuck in the villain base and now we're getting stared at by weird people. He says, everyone here is weird. I can name everything weird about you all. He says, what is it then? His name, it says, surely by you, Shigaraki, you crust, you, where's that chapstick? Himiko, you're addicted to blood. Dobby, you're all shriveled up. He says, you're shriveled up too. He says, at least I didn't put stitches on it. Actually, no, I don't anymore. It's gone. You're dumb. Compress. Alright, well, you're pretty much normal. You're normal. You're just a magician. You're a freaking ninja turtle. Magna, you have giant lips. Kurogiri, you're probably Aizawa's past classmate. I don't know. He says, how do you know that? He says, I have my ways, dum-dum. He says, I just named all features about you idiots. He says, and all you want to do is kill All Might. Why? He didn't even do anything to you. He says, now you might want to let me go before I jet burn you. He says, then they'll charge up their strongest attack and say, and Shigaraki, he says, you realize that you guys haven't said a thing to Bakugo, right? He says, we just used him here. He says, I don't care what you did. Now you're gonna get me out of here before I destroy this entire thing. He says, what? They let him go, but then he puts both of his hands like a Wakanda Forever and says, Providence! And then just gets a knife thrown at his, right across his face. He goes, shoot! Well, I can't move now, because if I move... Then Toga does the weirdest thing ever and tries to take the blood. He says, you better get out of my face before I jet to burn you. He says, I'd rather be put those chains back on my hands and just be standing and just be sitting down right on that seat than be back. Then, a couple hours later, they see, I am here! Trying to convince him to join the league, but Christian will not join. He says, I don't want to, y'all boring. He says, hold on a minute, Dobby, why is your hand wet? He says, have you been doing weird stuff? Bakugo says, of course not, maybe it's sweat. He says, then he looks and looks a little bit and says, and then literally Prominence flashes and goes, Prominence burns and goes, ah, and blows up the league base. He says, what the? He says, how do you have Toya's bracelet? He says, what do you mean? He says, Natsuo made that for Toya. How do you have it? He says, or are you Toya Todoroki? I will shoot. Then he pulls out a gun and spins it on his hand saying, you better tell me or I will pull the trigger. Then he pulls the trigger and then Dobby gets shot in the head, but he doesn't die. He's severely injured. He goes, Gah. Then Christian just clashes with him going, and that's all for this episode.